Chapter 2, A Funeral in Yorkshire. As the Sherwell headed into the night, a long-cased pendulum clock struck midnight in a comfortable Yorkshire farmhouse. The house was a substantial brick-built property with an immense Dutch gable trimmed in whitewashed plaster that bore the initials R, L, and the year 1740. It was the home of the Yorkshire family of Leadam, gentlemen farmers who had lived in the East Riding since time immemorial. They had a scatter of relatives from the port of Hull on the Humber to the Minster town of Beverley, a day's journey south of the county town of York. Recently the family had extended far beyond the bounds of the riding to London, in particular to a house in Tooley Street in Southwark. This was where the surgeon Christopher Leadam, the younger brother of Robert, the farmhouse owner, lived with his wife Charlotte and their only son, John. The clock ticked on. 14-year-old John poked at the Yule log in the inglenook fireplace, making it splutter and spit. The glow of the fading fire radiated around the wood-panelled room, burnishing the rows of pewter plates and tankards on the dresser with its orange light. Apart from the fire, the only other light in the room was a candle in a pewter candlestick standing on his father's coffin. The mantel shelf was swathed in red-berried holly and white-berried ivy sprigs, but Christmas seemed a lifetime away. Above the inglenook hung a pair of crossed claymores, looted by his grandfather from the Culloden battlefield in 1746. His grandfather had joined the Prince of Wales regiment to fight the Scots because he was for Parliament and a Protestant king. John knew the Leadams were brave and loyal Englishmen, and he knew that his father would expect him to uphold that tradition at his funeral in the morning. In the space of a week, his world had turned upside down. Before Boxing Day, he had been a happy young man on the verge of a career in medicine, but now as he sat staring into the fire, he had no idea what his future would be. He jabbed at it with the long iron poker, sending showers of red sparks up the chimney, and as he watched the tiny specks of light fade and die, he asked himself why God had taken his father. His father was a good man, he reasoned, a surgeon at Guy's Hospital, a man who helped the poor in their time of need. But he was also a man who dissected their bodies to find out what had killed them and to understand better how the human body worked. Was that wicked? Was that why God had taken him? And what of his father's soul in the day of judgment? The clock struck 1. John poked at the fire again. John decided that his father would pass any test God could set for him. If death were truly an opening into another world, to a heaven without pain or suffering, what the ancients called the Elysian fields, his father's soul would already be there. He stood and looked at his father's coffin. In the morning, he would bury his father's body. It was a body his immortal soul no longer required because it had departed with his last breath on earth. He did not know where his father's soul had gone, but he was sure that it had passed, and there was nothing for him or his father to fear. He put the poker down and took himself off to bed. Sinclair woke early, feeling tired and cold. He took a cup of tea in the saloon and went on deck. Hodge was making the morning sick call at the mainmast, but when no one arrived, he took the opportunity of joining his colleague for a stroll around the deck. The weather was cold but bright, and the wind was still coming from the east. Captain Greenwood was drilling his men on the quarterdeck, marching them up and down, making them present arms and practice firing formations. As they walked, the ship slipped south through the English Channel. Under the same blue sky, Christopher Leadam's coffin was lifted onto the hearse his brother had hired for the occasion from Beverley. Robert Leadam took his nephew's hand and set off along the lane to All Hallows in Walkington. John's mother, Charlotte, his aunt Maria and his cousin Lucy followed behind. When they arrived at the small square-towered church, the grass was covered in thick white frost, and the lichen-covered headstones sparkled with rime in the low winter sunshine. John had to admit that it was a more tranquil final resting place for his father than St. Olave's in Southwark. The thought of going back to London without his father stabbed at John's raw and broken heart. When the service was over, his uncle led his father's friends to the Fawcett Arms, where he had purchased a cask of ale and meat pies by way of a wake. John and the women rode back to the farm on the back of the hearse. The warmth of the farmhouse was welcome after they had been out in the cold for so long. Aunt Maria poured sherry into small pewter cups and handed out sweet biscuits. Maria sank back in her chair and heaved a weary sigh. You got the best of the two of them, you know. I have to admit I hankered after Christopher myself at one time. Mother, for goodness sake, Lucy squirmed. Aunt Charlotte doesn't want to hear all this. Shush, child, I'm just saying what's true, retorted her mother. Christopher turned the heads of lots of girls about these parts, but he was ambitious and knew he could do better for himself in London. Besides, my father wouldn't countenance a marriage without land, so I ended up with Robert and this damn place. Mother, how can you say that? This is our home. Well, just look at it. Nothing's changed since the day it was built. We've no china to speak of, no wallpaper and no decent furniture. How can I invite the ladies of Walkington here, let alone anyone from Beverley, without being the object of sympathy or derision? You're old enough to know that your father spends his money on horse racing and whores. Mother, Aunt Charlotte doesn't want to know our problems. Shush, child, when I'm speaking, Maria scolded. I'm not a child, I'll be 20 next year. 2 bastardy bonds he has to his name, too. Maria declared, spitting with anger. And if he sees a nag with long odds at Beverley or York, you can be sure he'll have money on it. It's no wonder I'm ashamed to venture into the town. On the Sherwell, Sinclair retired early and slept soundly. He awoke to the sickening smell of bilge accompanied by the rhythmic sound of pumping from the hold. Walking the deck, he found that the sunshine of the day before was gone. The sky was a blanket of thick grey clouds, and the sails were heavy with ice and salt. The boat was stationary, and the sea's grey merged with the sky in all directions. At supper, Sinclair fell into conversation with Captain Greenwood, a young man like himself who intended to forge a successful career in the East. He was a retired British Army officer who had been let go after the defeat in America, like so many others. His good looks and easy temperament seemed to smooth all his social interactions. He spoke eloquently of his experience in the American War, saying that he had had a mainly diplomatic role and had not seen much fighting. Sinclair was jealous of this man of easy conversation and conscience. Greenwood seemed to have no moral quandaries to wrestle with and was content to accept the world as he found it. The ship was moving at speed when Sinclair made his way on deck the next day. By lunchtime, the wind had become a gale. Sitting in the saloon with the other passengers, Sinclair felt a knot of fear tightening in his belly. In the hold, the younger recruits were calling for their mothers and puking in their hammocks. As the afternoon drifted into the evening, the atmosphere on board became as tight as a drum skin. Suddenly, the tension broke as the ship lurched to starboard with a mighty crack. In the saloon, the women screamed as the floor slipped away from them. They silently wondered what would happen next. The ship righted itself with an elastic thwack. The wind picked up again, and the ship pitched hypnotically, sending him into a trance-like state. The doctor was unsure how much time had passed before the ship rolled again, sending him and the women and the furniture flying like gaming counters against the cabin walls. Suddenly there was a near-splitting crack followed by a thunderous crash. Sinclair's heart leapt, and he let out a low groan. Surely this was it, the ship was breaking up, and he would soon be on his way to a watery grave. Merrick opened the saloon door. Dr. Sinclair, come with me. Mr. Hodge needs you. As soon as the door closed behind them, Merrick said, the mast's gone, we have 5 men overboard and 7 injured. He led Sinclair through the forest of stinking hammocks in the hold, past Captain Greenwood towards the front of the ship, where they found Hodge tending to the wounded. When they were done, Hodge congratulated Sinclair. You did a good job. I doubted you with all that book learning, but we made a good team tonight. Thank you, Sinclair replied, offering Hodge a cup of brandy. You're a very accomplished surgeon yourself, sir. I know, I've seen the best. You were every bit as good as Alexander McNeil in Edinburgh and John Hunter in London. Hodge chuckled, sipping his drink. I'll tell the captain that when I ask him for a pay rise. Sinclair walked back the way he had come. With the storm abating, the young soldiers were sleeping, and there was no sound from the women's accommodation either, which was a good sign. The only light on was Greenwood's, so he knocked on the door and waited to see if there was any reply. Come in, said Greenwood, raising his head from the pillow. I can't sleep. Sinclair looked at the handsome young man. His face was wet with tears. Well, that's not surprising. It's been a terrible night, he said, leaning on the door frame to steady himself as the ship gently rolled. It was so dark when all the lights went out. I hate the dark, I always have. Those bloody ruffians gave me hell. I had to threaten to shoot 2 of them to keep them from killing each other. Sinclair handed him some opium-laced claret, wished Greenwood a good night and headed for his own bed. Captain Richards led a funeral service for the men who had lost their lives the next day. Despite his Presbyterian upbringing, he did not believe that man was predestined, Voltaire had shown him the insanity of that. He believed that all men were born equal and free to live according to their consciences. If there was a God, he believed he was the creator of the natural laws that govern the universe and that he had given man a rational mind to understand them. As evening fell, Frank Greenwood found himself in a melancholy mood. He had considered himself a success, a gentleman and a competent officer before he had boarded the Cherwell. But now, sitting in the darkness, he questioned his abilities and conduct. He longed to be home at Panton Hall again. He wanted to be clean, lie in a bed that did not move, and sit by the window in the green drawing-room with a cup of coffee in his hand. He thought about his mother, Lady Frances, and how she would weep when she heard the news of his death, for he was sure he would perish. His morbid contemplations were disturbed by the arrival of Lieutenant Alsop, who confirmed the ship's perilous situation. "We cannot turn the ship, the wind is too strong," he explained in a low voice so that only Greenwood could hear. "We're heading straight for the rocks and will hit them sometime after midnight." Greenwood listened to the news of the impending disaster in silence. He did not know whether to be angry with God for the injustice of it all or simply to accept what had been decreed for him. "Wait below until the ship has grounded. Your men will be washed overboard if they venture onto the deck before that. When the ship has come to rest, it's every man for himself." News of the impending disaster arrived in the sickbay with Alsop. Sinclair said goodbye to Hodge as he took a lantern. Once inside his little canvas cabin, he loosened his clothing to dispose of it quickly, then took his pocket watch and checked the hour. It was nearly midnight. He closed it, kissed the back, then took a clean necktie from his chest, secured 3 guineas in it in knots, and tied it around his waist. He reckoned that he would need money to get back to London if he survived. A volley of cannon fire from the deck announced their imminent impalement on the rocks. Alsop and Merrick were stripped down to their shirts and breeches in the companionway. "We'll make landfall at any moment. Keep your lantern with you, you'll need it," advised Alsop. There was a sickening jolt, and they all found themselves on the floor. Then an enormous wave lifted the ship out of the water and pounded her onto the rocks with an almighty thud, and Sinclair knew he had to leave. On deck, the blizzard and the waves raged on. Soon Sinclair found himself in the water. He was under the waves, held in the current's grip for an age. When the current released its grip, he gasped for breath, and his head popped out into the air. The pain in his chest made him pant, but the water was calm, and there was no wind or snow. He could hear the strange echoey sound of men's voices. He thought, "I must be in a cave," and started to swim towards the echoing sounds. After a few strokes, he bumped his head on a ledge. He grabbed it with both hands and dragged himself onto it. Exhausted, all he wanted was to lie down, close his eyes, and sleep, but he knew that he would most certainly die if he did. Beyond the shelter of the cave, the storm crashed on. The wind roared, waves pounded the shore, and lightning raked the sky. Through the din, Sinclair heard a familiar sound. His heart leapt. It was his pocket watch, still working. The 3 small chimes told him it would be light in 4 hours. With his hope rekindled, Sinclair determined to stay awake and to live. To stay awake, he started to recall everything he knew about human anatomy, the name of every organ, every bone and every blood vessel. He even recited the passages from the Bible he had learned as a child. He thought about Iona and of their trip to Arthur's Seat. He pictured the wind in her hair. He recalled the smile on her face as he swung her around in the dance at the assembly rooms, their conversation about Voltaire and Defoe. Occasionally, he heard one of his companions falling into the water, and he redoubled his efforts to stay awake. But eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and he closed his eyes. He woke to the freezing grey light of dawn. Now he could see that the ledge he had spent the night on was some 10 feet above a pebbly beach and just inside a cave as he had thought. He looked down to see the bodies of his shipmates dotted along the beach and drifting out to sea. The ship was gone, smashed to pieces, and as the light grew stronger, he counted the prostrate bodies in red army coats played out like starfish on the shore. There were hundreds of them, and he was sure he could see a woman's petticoat floating in the surf. He retched, and his mouth filled with hot, acidic vomit. He spat it out and wiped his lips. Looking around, Sinclair discovered he was alone. Where had everyone gone? His legs were cold and stiff, but he pushed himself to stand. The pain was excruciating as the blood started to flow back into his veins. He had no idea how long it took him to reach the open air, but when he finally raised his eyes to the sky, He discovered he was at the bottom of a 90-foot cliff of jagged grey rock. He was about to panic when he saw a loop of thick rope moving in front of him. He reached out and grabbed it, and when he pulled on it he felt it jerk upwards. Hesitating briefly, the doctor placed it over his head to sit on his waist. He gave it a couple of jerks, and the rope tightened against his back. His body started to rise, and suddenly his world went black.